Both engines were gone. A Boeing 737 at 18,000 feet had become a 143,000-pound glider with 157 souls on board. 8 minutes of sky remained. The nearest runway was too far. Physics had already won. Then a woman's voice cut through the radio.
Calm.
Exact. Standing alone in a Kansas wheat field with nothing but a military radio that had hummed for 6 long years, she gave the captain a heading, a glide speed, a command to stay high over the tree line. She had already measured the 3-degree slope at the western end of her own field, the slope that would press the gear harder into the ground and give them the extra braking distance no one else could see. The jet crossed the trees with 12 feet to spare. Touchdown hit like thunder, 140 miles per hour into dry stubble. The fuselage shook, dust exploded, then the nose began to swing left. 1 heartbeat from cartwheeling into the trees. "Right rudder," she screamed. "Now!" The aircraft straightened, slowed, stopped 180 feet from disaster. When the golden dust finally cleared, 157 people were still breathing. But for the woman who had just talked a commercial jet onto a dirt field, the real test was only beginning. Sky over Kansas was the kind of blue that made you believe nothing bad could ever happen. Wide, cloudless, the particular shade of October that painters tried to capture and never quite managed. The kind of sky that made farmers stop their tractors and look up for just a second before remembering there was work to do. Dara Kelleher did not look up. She was on her back under the water pump housing at the east end of the barn, a wrench in her right hand, flashlight clenched between her teeth, trying to convince a rusted coupling that had not moved in 3 years to move right now. Her boots were muddy. Her green jacket had a tear along the left shoulder from last Tuesday, when she had caught it on a fence wire. Her hands were the hands of someone who fixed things, calloused across the palm. A small scar at the base of the thumb from a tractor blade in 2006 that she barely remembered anymore. She looked like a farmer. That was the point. Outside, the October afternoon was doing what October afternoons in Kansas do, going quiet, going gold. The north fields had already been cut, the corn rows standing as pale stubble in the low-angle light. The wheat in the south was 3 weeks past harvest, the ground there firm and dry and the color of pale straw. The soybeans near the road had come in well this year, better than last year. She had allowed herself exactly 1 moment of satisfaction about that, standing at the edge of the soybean field on a Thursday morning, arms folded, nodding once at nothing in particular. That was as close as Dara Kelleher got to celebrating 83 acres. All of it hers, all of it managed alone, no farmhands, no partners. Just Dara and the land and the particular silence of a life lived entirely on her own terms. She liked the silence. That was the thing people did not understand about her, the few who tried. They thought the silence was loneliness. It was not. It was the opposite of loneliness. It was the absence of all the things that had once filled her life with noise, the briefings, the radio chatter, the roar of engines on a flight line, the particular density of being responsible for other people's lives every single day for 14 years. The silence was what she had bought when she bought this farm. 380 acres of quiet, paid for in full. The neighbors in the small town 12 miles east knew her well enough to wave. Well enough to leave a casserole on the porch when the weather turned bad. Well enough to know she would not ask hacks for help and would return the dish clean within 2 days. Thought they understood her. Quiet woman, self-sufficient, moved out here 6 years ago after some kind of military service, they supposed, though she never talked about it. Kept to herself, fixed her own machines, grew her own food. They thought they knew Dara Kelleher. They did not know her at all. She had been born in Salina, Kansas, the daughter of a wheat farmer and a school librarian who between them had given her 2 things that lasted her entire life: a deep knowledge of how land works and a deeper knowledge of how stories work. She had been good at science the way some people are good at music, not studiously, but naturally, in a way that did not feel like work. Physics made sense to her. Math made sense. The relationship between forces and surfaces and speeds and angles made a kind of immediate visual sense in her mind that her teachers struggled to explain in words. She had looked at a fighter jet in a photograph in a library book when she was 9 years old and thought, I want to understand how that works, not I want to fly it. That came later. First came the wanting to understand, the wanting to know what held a thing that heavy in the air, what kept it up, what brought it down. The invisible architecture of lift and drag and thrust and weight that let metal do the one thing metal was never meant to do. By the time she was 22, she was a student pilot in the Navy's aviation program at NAS, Pensacola, Florida. By 24, she had her wings. By 26, she was flying FC-18 Hornets at Naval Air Station Oceana in Virginia Beach. She was not the first woman in the program. She flew like she intended to be the last person anyone questioned about it. 14 years, 2 operational deployments, 1,847 total flight hours, 284 of them at night. Call sign Iron Hand, earn not given. Because her landings was always clean, always precise. Even in bad weather. Even on pitching carrier decks. Even in conditions that made other pilots grip the controls until their knuckles went white. There was a story the younger pilots used to tell about her. A maintenance crew chief had said it first, watching her bring a damaged Hornet back onto the deck in weather that had waved off 2 other aircraft. The bird was streaming hydraulic fluid, the deck was pitching 12 feet, and she set it down so soft the crew chief swore he did not feel the trap. He had looked at the landing signal officer and said, "That woman's got an iron hand, and it's stuck." It went up and down both coasts. It followed her into ready rooms and bars in the official record. Iron hand because the hand never shook. And then she was a farmer, 40 miles northwest of Wichita, in a green jacket with a tear in the left shoulder. On her back under a water pump housing with a wrench in her hand and grease on her face and dirt everywhere else, she did not miss flying. That was what she told herself. Every morning when she walked into the barn. Every time she looked up at a contrail crossing the wide Kansas sky and then looked deliberately back down at the ground. Every time a neighbor asked, making conversation, if she missed it. No, she would say. And mean something she never said out loud. Something that lived underneath the word. Something that had nothing to do with whether she missed it and everything to do with whether she deserved to. The answer to that question was no. She was sure of it. She had been sure of it for 6 years. On the north wall of the barn, past the tractor manuals and the seed catalogs from 2 seasons ago that she kept meaning to throw away. Past the mason jar of miscellaneous bolts and screws that accumulated over years like sediment. There was a radio, military grade, the kind built for field use in conditions where commercial radios failed, the kind that reached emergency frequencies clearly, that could cut through interference and weather, and the particular electromagnetic noise of industrial equipment, and still find the channel it was looking for. She had bought it at a government surplus sale in Wichita 4 years after she got out. She could not explain why. She had told herself it was practical. She lived alone, far from town. If there was a weather emergency, a structural fire, a medical situation, the military radio gave her better range and reliability than a cell phone in a county where cell phones did not always work. That was why she had it. That was not why she had it. She knew that on some level she could not quite reach, the level where the real reasons live, underneath the reasons we give ourselves. She kept it on because some part of her that did not consult the rest of her, some part that still wore a flight's suit in its deep memory, still heard the deck of a carrier in its bones, still listened for a voice in distress on a frequency nobody else was monitoring, was not done, was not finished, was waiting for something it could not name. It was just there. It had always been on. Every morning she came into the barn, the power light glowed and the static hummed low, like a heartbeat in an empty room, like the sound of something that had not finished waiting. She had never asked herself what it was waiting for. She did not ask now. She wiped the grease from her hands on the rag she kept hooked on the shelf and looked at it for a moment the way you look at things that have become part of the furniture of your life, without seeing them clearly, without asking why they are there. Then she went back to the pump housing, the thing about retired pilots, about the specific kind of person who spends 14 years flying fighter aircraft in conditions that demand absolute precision, is that they do not fully retire. Skills do not take their leave when the papers are signed and the uniforms are folded and the keys to the base housing are turned in. The skills remain stored, the way water stores in clay, present but not moving there, waiting. Every landing Dara Kelleher had ever made was still in her hands. Every dead-stick approach she had practiced in the simulator until it was reflex. Every bad weather night arrival, every carrier landing in the dark when the deck was pitching and the lights were dim, and the only thing between a clean trap and a catastrophic wave-off was the steadiness of her own hands, all of it. Still in her, she just had not had occasion to use it. She thought, sometimes in the quiet evenings, about how strange that was, how a person could carry an entire second self inside them, folded up, put away. A self that knew how to do things the daytime self had forgotten it knew. She wondered if other people were like that. The school teacher in town had a folded-up self that knew how to do something extraordinary and had simply stopped. If the man who ran the feed store did. If everybody walking around was carrying some packed-away version of who they used to be, waiting on a shelf in the back of the barn with the power light on, she did not know. She knew about her own, and she had made her peace, or what she called peace, which was really just a kind of managed silence, with the fact that the folded-up self would stay folded up, that the skills would stay stored, that she would die an old woman on this farm having never used them again, and that this was right. This was the appropriate sentence for a person who had failed when it mattered, until the wrench slipped. She banged her knuckle against the coupling housing and said something that was not fit for company. Then she stopped, lay still on her back in the dirt, and listened. There was a sound in the sky, not the drone of a crop duster, not the thin buzz of a private Cessna out of the airfield at Newton. Something bigger, something that should have been louder. That was the problem. It was big, and it was too quiet. She knew that sound. Or rather, she knew the absence inside that sound. She had heard it once before, years ago, on a training range, when an engine flamed out on an aircraft a quarter mile from her and the world went briefly, horribly quiet in exactly that way. Sound of a heavy thing in the air with no power moving it. The sound of gravity winning a slow argument. Dara came out from under the pump housing in one motion, stood up, turned her face to the sky, there, northwest and dropping. Silver shape at what she estimated, instantly, automatically, without deciding to, at roughly 18,000 feet. A large commercial aircraft. Boeing, probably a 737 variant based on the fuselage profile. Both engines. Dark, not feathered for fuel economy, not trailing smoke from a fire. Just dark. Her brain did not panic. Her brain did math. Rate of visual estimation, approximately 1,800 to 2,000 feet per minute for a clean glide at that weight class. Glide ratio for a 737 with both engines out, somewhere around 17:1, meaning for every foot it dropped to travel 17 feet forward. But only if the pilots flew it exactly right, only if they held best glide speed, only if they did not panic and pull the nose up and trade their precious airspeed for a few seconds of false hope. Distance to the nearest commercial airport, Wichita's mid-continent, roughly 40 miles southeast. At this descent rate and this altitude, that aircraft would reach ground level in approximately 7, maybe 8 minutes. The airport was too far. She ran the numbers twice. Got the same answer both times. The airport was too far, and there was nothing between that aircraft and the ground except farmland. Farmland. Then she ran toward the barn. Side Kansas City Center. The air traffic control facility that managed this sector of upper Midwest airspace. The afternoon shift had been running clean. No major weather. No airspace conflicts. Routine sequencing of arrivals and departures through a system so practiced it moved like breathing. Then the Mayday call broke through Captain Briggs Callahan's voice. Tight but controlled. The voice of a man who had flown 19 years of commercial aviation and was using every one of those years right now to keep himself from becoming a different kind of voice entirely. Mayday. 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 United Express 2749. We have lost both engines. Repeat, both engines, 157 souls on board. We are currently at 18,000 feet and descending. We need options. The room did not freeze. That was the training. The training said you never freeze, so no one froze. But the room did something that was almost worse. Every person in it kept moving, kept doing their jobs, while simultaneously understanding what the math meant. Controllers grabbed charts, called up runway data, looked at distances. The cursor on the radar screen blinked over a target that was descending at a rate that turned every nearby airport into a cruel joke. Supervisor Radner, 16 years in the facility, stood at the console and ran the numbers himself. He did not trust the first answer. He ran them again. Mid-Continent Airport, too far. Salina Regional, too far. Liberal, too far. Every runway within range required either more altitude or more time than United 2049 had. The aircraft was a glider now. A 140, 0-pound glider with 157 people aboard, and 8 minutes of sky left beneath it. There was a particular silence that came over an air traffic control room in a moment like this. Not the silence of people who had stopped working. The silence of people who were working harder than they had ever worked in their lives and had nothing to show for it. The silence of competence colliding with physics and losing. In the cockpit, Briggs and his first officer Ren Sato had been through every emergency checklist they carried. Engine restart procedures, hydraulic system review, fuel system crossfeed, alternate ignition sequences, everything. Nothing. Both engines were gone, not damaged. Not malfunctioning in any recoverable way, gone. The plane was flying on momentum and gravity, and the skill of two pilots who were very good at their jobs and had never once trained for exactly this. Wren's voice was steady. That was the first thing Briggs noticed. She had been running every system check available since the second engine went out, and her voice had not changed. Same cadence, same precision, like the steadiness was a decision she had made at the very beginning of this and was simply not going to revisit no matter what happened. Nothing on restart, she said. I know, hydraulics nominal. We have control, I know, we're a glider, I know. 19 years. He had flown through storms and bird strikes in a cargo fire over the Atlantic. He had never lost both engines. Nobody trained for both engines. You trained for one. You trained for the engine that kept running. Losing both at once was the kind of thing that happened a handful of times in the entire history of commercial aviation, and most of those times the story did not end with everyone walking away. He grabbed the radio. Back in the barn, Dara grabbed the military radio from the shelf. Her hands knew what to do before her mind finished deciding, found the emergency frequency, the one she had never used, the one that had always been open, always humming just in case. She keyed the transmit button, Kansas City Center. This is a private citizen transmitting on guard. I have visual on what I believe is United Express 2749. I want to help. The first voice that came back was clipped. Dismissive. Voice of a busy person managing a crisis who did not have time for a civilian on a non-emergency frequency. Ma'am, please keep this line clear for. I am a former Navy fighter pilot. She said it the way she had once recited her call sign in a ready room. Not to impress, not to intimidate, just factually. This is what is true, this is what is relevant. This is what you need to know right now, Commander. 14 years of service. Over 1,800 hours in the cockpit. Call sign Iron Hand. That aircraft has approximately 7 minutes before it reaches the ground. I have a flat harvested wheat field that is 3/4 of a mile long and firm surfaced. I am requesting permission to guide that aircraft in. Silence, not dismissal. Silence. The difference mattered enormously, because in that silence, on the other end of the frequency, a man was deciding what kind of moment this was, whether the voice he had just heard was a delusion or a lifeline, whether the next thing he did would be the thing that mattered or the thing that got in the way of the thing that mattered. The whole rest of the afternoon turned on that silence. 157 lives balanced on it, and Dara waited, standing in the doorway of her barn, radio in one hand, the other hand already shading her eyes, tracking the silver shape that was lower now, close enough that she could see it was descending in a straight, clean line, flown by someone who had not yet given up. She had been waiting 6 years. She could wait 4 more seconds. Supervisor Radner had a file. Somewhere in the back architecture of his professional memory, the part that filed things that were not quite right, that were flagged, that were worth remembering for no reason he could currently name. He had a file with that call sign in it. Iron Hand, Commander. Report refusal. Conduct review. Voluntary separation. That was the official version. Radner had also read between the lines of official versions for 16 years. He was very good at it. He knew how institutional language worked. He knew what voluntary separation meant when it followed conduct review and was preceded by report refusal. He knew what it meant when a decorated pilot with nearly 2,000 flight hours and a spotless operational record became the subject of an internal flag that nobody could point to a specific rule violation for. He knew it meant the pilot had made someone uncomfortable. He knew it meant the pilot had been right about something that powerful people needed to be wrong about. He had seen it before. Not in aviation exactly, but in every institution he had ever worked inside of. The way the machine closed ranks, the way it had 100 quiet mechanisms for removing a person who would not go along, none of which ever appeared in writing as what they actually were. Flag in the file did not say this person told the truth and we punished her for it. The flag in the file said conduct review, but Radner knew how to read. He looked at the radar screen. The blip that was United 2749 was lower than it had been 40 seconds ago, sending steady, descending clean, no deviation, no spiral. Whoever was flying that plane was flying it beautifully, but the math remained what the math was. The airport remained as far away as the distance said it was. He had a choice. He could go by the file. File said this woman was a problem. The file said she had been removed from a structure that did not want her. The careful, cover yourself, never get blamed move was to keep the frequency clear, follow procedure, and let the aircraft come down wherever physics decided it would come down. Nobody would ever fault him for following procedure. Procedure was the thing you hid behind when there was nothing else to do. Or he could go by the radar. The radar did not care about files. The radar did not care about conduct reviews or institutional discomfort. or who had made whom uncomfortable 6 years ago at a base in Virginia. The radar only knew altitude and time, and the altitude was decreasing and the time was running out. And somewhere down there in a wheat field was a voice that had said the word, firm surfaced without being prompted. A voice that had given a credible, immediate, technical description of a landing surface. A voice that did not panic. That was not a voice that was guessing. That was the voice of someone who had done hard things before. "This is Supervisor Radner," he said. "What is your exact location, Commander?" He used the rank. He noticed himself using it. The file said former. The file said separated. But the radar said this woman knew exactly what she was looking at, and some older instinct in Radner, the instinct that knows competence when it hears it, that has learned to trust the calm voice over the credentialed one, used the rank anyway. She gave him everything, GPS coordinates. Field dimensions, 3,960 feet in length, approximately 300 feet wide. Surface condition, post-harvest wheat stubble, dry, firm, last rainfall 11 days prior. Tree line at the eastern boundary, mixed cottonwood and elm, approximately 50 feet at peak height. Power lines, single-run agricultural line along the south fence, approximately 25 feet above grade. Drainage feature, a natural slope of approximately 3 degrees beginning 2,800 feet from the eastern boundary, running toward the western end. She gave it the way she had once liked most briefs. Precise, inconsequential, without editorializing, without a single wasted word. Every piece of information in the order a pilot would need it, prioritized by relevance, delivered at a pace a person under stress could actually absorb. Radner was writing as fast as he could. He had patched a lot of calls throughs in 16 years. He had never patched one through to a voice like this. "Stand by, Commander." A pause, patching you through to the cockpit. Static then. "United 1249, this is Dara Kelleher. Call sign Iron Hand. I have visual on your aircraft. Do you copy?" And a man's voice, tight, controlled, the voice of someone using everything they had to stay on the right side of the line between function and collapse, came back. Iron Hand. "This is Captain Briggs Callahan. I copy you. Please tell me you have good news." She looked up at the aircraft. It was lower now. She could see it with the naked eye, the silver shape descending in a long, clean arc over the pale autumn fields. Both engines dark, wings level. Whoever was flying that plane was flying it beautifully, which meant she had something to work with. Which meant the pilot up there had not given the airplane away to panic. Which meant there was a chance. She did not let herself feel the chance. Not yet. Feeling the chance was a thing you did afterward. She pressed the transmit button. 3/4 of a mile long. Flat and dry. "I can guide you in. But I need you to follow every instruction exactly. No second guessing, no hesitation. Can you do that?" A pause. "Iron Hand, is that really you? As in the pilot from Oceana who landed FC-18 on a mountain access road in?" "Yes, that was me. But right now I need your altitude and airspeed, Captain. We can talk history later." 3 seconds then, altitude 14,000 feet. Descent rate 2,900 feet per minute. Airspeed 175 knots. Weight approximately 143,000 pounds. She was already moving out of the barn, walking toward the center of her field, the radio in one hand, her eyes on the aircraft and on the field in the same sweep, measuring the one against the other, fitting the falling thing to the waiting ground. "Good," she said into the radio. "Here is what we are going to do. Before we follow that voice out into a Kansas wheat field, before we follow it through the next 8 minutes, that would change everything for 157 people and for the woman standing in the stubble holding the radio. There is something you need to know about Dara Kelleher, not the version the neighbors knew. Not the version that could be assembled from the surface of a life. The muddy boots, the green jacket, the quiet woman who waved from her truck and never asked for anything. The real version. The one that explains why a military-grade radio sat on a barn shelf with its power light glowing every single day for 6 years. The one that explains the answer underneath the word, no. The one that explains why a woman who could fly like that was hiding in a wheat field in the first place. The winter of 2003, NAS Oceana, Virginia Beach, a training exercise. 2 young pilots. Good pilots, both of them. Careful and skilled and exactly the kind of people you wanted in cockpits. One of them was 26. The other was 28. One of them had a wife who was pregnant with their first child. The other had been Dara's student 2 years earlier and still called her ma'am, even though they were close enough now to be friends. Even though she had told him a dozen times he could use her name, a maneuver sequence that had been cleared by the commanding officer. An incident that nobody saw coming because the risk had been assessed as acceptable, and the assessment had been wrong. Both pilots did not come home. Dara had been on the ground that day. She had watched it happen. She had heard the calls on the radio, and she had known, in the particular way that a trained ear knows, that something was wrong several seconds before it became visibly wrong. She had keyed her own radio to say something, to call a warning, and in the time it took her to decide what to say, in the half-second of hesitation while her mind searched for the right words, the window had closed. She would carry that half-second for 6 years. She would tell herself it was the half-second that mattered, that if she had been faster, sharper, less careful about getting the words exactly right, she could have changed it. She was wrong about this. The truth was that nothing she could have said in that half-second would have altered the physics that was already in motion. The truth was that the two pilots were already inside an envelope of failure that had been built into the maneuver before either of them ever strapped in. But grief does not care about the truth. Grief looks for the place where you touch the thing, and it builds a monument there, and it makes you visit every day. An investigation was convened. Reports were written. A conclusion was reached. The conclusion placed full responsibility on the two pilots, citing error and failure to follow procedure. Dara read the report twice. Then she read the raw data. The raw data told a different story. The data said the maneuver sequence itself had a flaw, a timing window that narrowed under conditions present that day that had not been adequately modeled in the planning. Data said the pilots had followed procedure correctly. The data said the procedure was the problem, and that someone had known about the problem, and someone had chosen to go ahead anyway, and now two families had folded flags on their mantelpieces, and a pregnant widow was learning to sleep alone. She went to her commanding officer. She was told to sign the report. She said she could not sign something she knew to be false. She remembered the exact moment, the office, the flag in the corner, the CO behind the desk, a man she had respected, a man who had pinned a commendation on her 2 years earlier, looking at her now with an expression that was not anger. That was worse than anger. It was disappointment. It was the look of a man who had expected her to understand how the world worked, and was sad to discover that she did not. He had said, not unkindly, "Commander, sometimes the right thing and the smart thing are not the same thing." She had said, "Then I'll do the right thing." And he had said, "I know you will." And the way he said it had told her everything about what was coming. What happened next took 3 months and did not happen loudly. It happened in the quiet ways institutions protect themselves. Reassignments, performance reviews that were carefully worded but unmistakably cool. Invitations not extended. Conversations that stopped when she walked into a room. The gradual, efficient, deniable process of making someone understand that they were not welcome anywhere that mattered anymore. No single moment you could point to. No memo that said what was actually happening. Just 1,000 small doors closing one after another, each one quiet, till a woman who had given 14 years to the Navy understood that the Navy was finished with her. She resigned her commission in March of 2003. Nobody tried to talk her out of it. That was the part that stayed with her. Not the closing doors. Silence where someone should have said, "Don't go." She had given them 14 years and 1,847 hours and a record without a single blemish until the moment she refused to lie, and when she walked out the door, nobody followed her into the parking lot to say, "Wait." She drove back to Kansas. She bought the farm her father had left her when he died. She planted wheat, and she brought with her the bone-deep, sleep-disrupting, quiet morning certainty that her skill had been present on the day those two pilots died, that she had understood the flaw in the maneuver, that she had felt the wrongness coming before it came, that she had hesitated for half a second when it mattered most, and that the half-second was the whole story, and the half-second was her fault, and a person who failed like that did not get to keep flying. She was wrong about this. The hesitation had changed nothing. The physics had already decided. But she did not know she was wrong, because no one had ever told her, because the only people who could have told her were busy signing a report that said the opposite, busy building the official lie that she had refused to put her name to. And so the wrongness sat in her chest like a stone for 6 years. Not loudly. She was not a person who wore her wounds visibly, but it was there, every morning when she walked into the barn, every time she looked up at a contrail and then looked away, every time a neighbor asked if she missed flying. No, she would say, "I don't deserve to." The radio on the barn shelf she could not explain. Or she could, but the explanation lived in a place she did not visit. The explanation was that some part of her had never accepted the sentence she had passed on herself. Some part of her was still listening to the guard frequency, still waiting for the call she had missed. still hoping that somewhere someday there would be a voice in distress and a half-second to act, and that this time, she would not hesitate. 6 years she kept the radio on. 6 years the call did not come, and now she was standing in her wheat field with a Boeing 737 falling out of the October sky above her. And the math was clear, and the field was right there, and she knew with the same bone-level certainty that she knew anything, that she was the only person within range who could put that aircraft on the ground with 157 people still breathing. The question was not whether she could do it. The question was whether she still believed she had the right to try. Because here is the thing about doubt. Doubt is loud in the quiet. In the mornings when you are alone on 380 acres with nothing but the sound of wind in the soybean rows and your own thoughts going in circles. Doubt fills a room, fills a barn, fills a chest where a stone already sits. Doubt had been Dara Kelleher's most constant companion for 6 years, and doubt had a single message it repeated every day. You failed once when it mattered, and you will fail again. And people will die, and it will be your fault. And the only safe thing, the only responsible thing, is to never put yourself in that position again. Stay in the field, fix the pump, plant the wheat. Keep your iron hand in your pocket where it cannot hurt anyone. But when the real moment arrives, the one doubt has been waiting its whole life to undermine, doubt goes quiet. Because the real moment is too loud for doubt. The real moment does not have room for the question of whether you deserve to act. The real moment only has room for the action. 157 people were falling out of the sky, and the part of Dara that asked whether she had the right to save them was, in that moment, simply overruled by the part of her that knew how. She keyed the transmit button, and this was the real moment the radio crackled in her hand. The silver shape filled more of the sky, and 6 years of doubt went silent, all at once the way a room goes silent when the most important person finally walks in. "Good," she said into the radio. "Here is what we are going to do." The field was not beautiful. Not in the way people mean when they call things beautiful. Not soft, not romantic. Flat Kansas farmland in mid-October. Pale stubble where the wheat had been. The color of old paper. The color of things that had given everything they had for the season, and were now waiting for whatever came next. Dara Kelleher walked out into the center of it, boots crunching through the stubble. The October light coming in low and gold at that particular afternoon angle that Kansas does better than anywhere else on Earth. Long shadows, wide sky. The silence that is actually full of sound if you know how to listen. Wind across cut grain, hawks somewhere northeast, the distant hum of a state highway 4 miles away, and above all of it, falling through all of it, a silver shape. Getting larger by the second, she raised the binoculars with her left hand. Radio in her right. The aircraft was in a clean glide. Wings perfectly level, nose attitude slightly high, which was exactly right for a dead stick approach at this weight. Whoever was up there was doing everything right with nothing left to do it with. He felt a small flicker of something that was almost respect. The pilot had not panicked. The pilot was flying the airplane all the way down, the way you were supposed to, the way that was so much harder than it sounded when the engines were silent and the ground was coming up. 13,000 feet now, she had maybe 6 minutes. 6 minutes to put a 140, 0-pound aircraft on 3/4 of a mile of wheat stubble without a runway. Without lights, without foam trucks or crash crews, or any of the infrastructure that existed specifically, because this situation was not supposed to be survivable. 6 minutes to do the thing that the entire architecture of modern aviation had been built to prevent from ever being necessary. She pressed the transmit button. "Captain Callahan, I have you visual. Give me an altitude check. 13,200. Set rate holding at 900. Airspeed 172 knots. Good. Turn to heading 265 east to west across my field. You will have a slight crosswind component from the northwest, about 8 knots, which is manageable. Your ground speed at touchdown will feel fast. That is expected. That is accounted for. Do not fight it." Turning to 265, she watched the aircraft bank, slowly, deliberately. A big commercial aircraft in a banking turn with no engine power looks nothing like a fighter jet doing the same thing. A Hornet snapped through turns. It was eager. It wanted to move. This was the opposite. This was a heavy thing being asked to do something against its nature, rolling into the turn with a kind of patient reluctance, trading altitude for the heading change because altitude was the only currency it had left, and it could not afford to spend much. But it banked, and it rolled out on the new heading, and it was pointed straight, filed now. The field. Dara knew this field the way she knew her own hands. She had plowed it in March, the cold mornings with frost on the steering wheel of the tractor, seeded it in April, watched it come up through May, the first green haze over the brown ground that always, every year, surprised her with how much it moved her. Walked the rows in June, checking for rust and aphids. Harvested it in late September with the old combine that needed a new belt, and groaned through the long golden days of the cut. She knew where the ground was hardest. The strip along the north side, where the drainage was best and the soil had the most clay content, and the post-harvest surface was almost like packed dirt. She knew the soft patch near the old fence post at the 200-foot mark on the south edge, a depression where water collected in spring, where the soil never quite dried out completely even in October, where the wheel of a heavy aircraft would sink and drag and potentially pull the nose offline at exactly the wrong moment. She had already calculated around the soft patch. The approach track she had given Briggs kept the aircraft's path well north of it. She had already calculated the tree line. The cottonwood and elm along the east boundary were between 45 and 55 feet tall. The tallest one, the old cottonwood at the southeast corner that she had considered cutting down twice and never got around to, the one she now blessed herself for keeping because it gave her a known reference point. She needed that aircraft to clear by at least 80 feet. She had already calculated the power lines. Single agricultural line, south fence, approximately 25 feet above grade. She needed the approach track to stay at least 400 feet north of the south boundary. And she had calculated the slope. This was the one that mattered. This was the calculation she had made in the doorway of the barn in the 3 seconds before she keyed the radio, and it was the calculation that everything else depended on. And it was the calculation that no one else on Earth could have made. Here is what no one else knew. Supervisor Radner had mentioned, during the 60 seconds between patching her through and stepping back to let her work, that there was another field, larger, flatter, 6 miles north, a harvested cornfield belonging to a family named Whitmore that had been cleared 2 weeks earlier and measured over a mile in usable length, more length. Flatter surface, more room on paper, better in every way. Any engineer looking at the two options on a map would have chosen the Whitmore field. More margin, more forgiveness. A longer runway is always safer than a shorter one. Every pilot in the world knows that. It is one of the first things you learn. Dara had not taken 4 seconds to answer. No, she said. My field, because of the slope, the western end of her wheat field carried a natural drainage grade of approximately 3 degrees, almost invisible to the eye. The kind of thing you only knew about if you had plowed that ground yourself. If you had watched the spring water sheet off it year after year. If you had stood at the west end in March and watched the runoff move across the face of it in a thin silver film catching the morning light. 3 degrees, which sounds like nothing. Which is nothing for almost every purpose a person could have. But at 143, 0 pounds moving at 140 miles per hour on a surface that cannot break the way a runway breaks. 3 degrees of downslope grade at the far end of the landing roll changes everything. The downslope increases the normal force on the landing gear as the aircraft pitches slightly forward onto it. Increased normal force increases the friction available at the brakes. More friction means more deceleration. More deceleration means a shorter stopping distance. She had run it in her head. At this weight, at this speed, on this surface, slope would shave approximately 14% off the stopping distance compared to a flat surface with identical texture and moisture content. It gave her approximately 170 to 190 additional feet. Not nothing. In fact, everything. The difference between stopping in the field and not stopping in the field. The difference between 157 people walking out of the wheat and 157 people meeting the tree line at the western edge at 60 miles an hour. The Whitmore cornfield, 1 mile of flat, open, forgiving ground, would not stop this aircraft in time. She was certain of it. The flatness that looked safer on a map was the very thing that would kill them, because flat ground gave you nothing extra, and on a surface this imperfect, with brakes that could only do so much, you needed something extra. You needed the slope. She could not prove this to anyone in the next 4 minutes. She could not lay the calculation out in language that Radner or Briggs or the engineers at Boeing could check in real time. There was no time to show her work. She just knew. And the knowing had to be enough. Because if she was wrong, if her math had an error somewhere, if she had misremembered the grade, if the soil moisture was different than she believed after 11 dry days, the friction coefficient of wheat stubble was not what she thought it was. Then 157 people died on her calculation alone. Her number, her decision, her field. Nobody else's name on it, nobody to share the weight. This was the thing she had spent 6 years avoiding. This exact thing. The position where her judgment alone stood between people and the ground. She had told herself she would never stand in this position again. She had built a whole life out of never standing here, and here she was, standing in the center of her own field, holding the whole calculation alone, the way she had held a calculation alone 10,000 times before, in cockpits over oceans, on the worst night of her first deployment, when the weather closed in and the deck pitched, and she had brought the aircraft home on instruments and instinct and the steadiness that had earned her a name. She carried the weight into the center of the field. She stood there with it, and she pressed the transmit button. Altitude check, Captain. Descent rate 1,900. We're stable. Good. Keep it there. We will begin landing configuration at 10,000 feet. Until then, tell me about your passengers. Pause. Why does that matter right now? It was a fair question. There were 100 things to think about, and the people in the back were not, strictly, one of the variables in the landing equation. The landing equation was altitude and airspeed and configuration and surface. The people were just the reason for the equation. They were not part of solving it. Except they were. Except Dara knew something about flying that did not appear in any manual. She did not say all of it. She said, "Because you are flying on instruments in training right now, and both of those things can carry you through almost anything, but they carry you further when they are attached to something real, something that breathes. I want you to remember what you are flying for. Tell me." Another pause, shorter. Then Briggs Callahan's voice changed, just slightly, just enough. The professional layer thinned and something human came up underneath it, the way warmth comes up through floorboards. 7-seat D. Dr. Soleil Okafor. She is a physician. She has been in rural Louisiana for 8 months doing post-Katrina medical work. She is going home. Dara said nothing. Let him continue. Kept her eyes on the descending shape. She did not scream when the engines went out. Did not grab the armrests. I could see her on the cabin camera. She waited about 30 seconds, and then she unbuckled and started moving through the aisle, checking on people, talking to the ones who were panicking. She sat down next to a woman in row 12 who was hyperventilating and just held her hand. Stayed there. Still there, far as I know, quiet for a moment. Row 19, seats C and D. Gus and Loretta Fenwick, a flight attendant told me. Married 58 years. Going to Portland to meet their grandson for the first time. The baby is 4 days old. They have not held him yet. They were going to hold him tomorrow. Dara kept her eyes on the aircraft, closer now. Descending clean, when the oxygen masks deployed, Gus put Loretta's on before his own. He looks like he is in his late 70s, hands shaking so bad he could barely manage the strap. Put hers on first anyway, then his own. Then he took her hand, and I'm told he hasn't let go since. She let that sit a moment in the gold light. Row 23, seat F. Renata Shields, firefighter out of Tucson. She is flying to Washington, D.C. She was supposed to receive the National Valor Award tomorrow morning. She pulled 3 people out of a burning apartment building in April. Went back in twice after the first time. When the stairs were already gone, he paused. When the mask came down just now, Renata got up, same as the doctor. Walked the aisle. Made sure every older passenger in her section had their mask on correctly before she put on her own. Then she sat back down. She's just looking out the window now, calm as anything. I don't know how, silence on the frequency. Dara looked at the silver shape coming down toward her field, and for just a moment, she let herself feel the full weight of what was inside it, not numbers, not in 57s and souls as an abstraction. A doctor holding a stranger's hand, an old man who put his wife's mask on first, a firefighter who could not stop running toward danger even from inside an airplane that was itself the danger. People who, even falling out of the sky, had spent their last terrified minutes taking care of each other. She would not let them down. She had let 2 pilots down once, or believed she had, which for 6 years had been the same thing. She would not do it again. Whatever she had or had not done in that half second in 2003, whatever the truth of it was, she still believed the worst of herself. She had one chance right now in this field to put her iron hand on the scale and tip it the other way. Then Dara spoke, and her voice did not shake. Then we make sure Dr. Okafor goes home to her patients. We make sure Gus and Loretta hold that baby. We make sure Renata gets to that ceremony. A beat, altitude captain, 10,000 feet, configure for landing. Flaps to position 5. Landing gear down. Do it now. The aircraft groaned. That was the sound. Not a mechanical failure. The particular groan of a large aircraft changing its aerodynamic shape, flaps extending into the slipstream, The whole wing geometry shifting, the drag coefficient climbing, the descent rate accelerating in response. Sound of a thing committing. No going back from this configuration, no altitudes left for a second approach. No go-around when there is no engine to power one. One chance. One field. One woman standing in the wheat stubble with a radio and a calculation she could not prove. Inside the cabin, the passengers felt it. Some grabbed armrests. Some closed their eyes. Some had already moved past the first sharp shock of terror into the strange suspended state that extreme situations sometimes produce, where the body has done everything it can and now simply waits, and the waiting itself becomes a kind of unearthly calm, almost peace, the calm of having nothing left to do but be carried. Dr. Soleil Okafor had been asked 3 times by the flight attendants to return to her seat before she finally did. She sat down, buckled her belt, looked out the window. The ground below was flat and gold, and coming up slowly, fields and roads and the occasional cluster of farm buildings catching the late light. She thought, with the slightly detached clarity that extreme stress sometimes brings, it looks like home. Flatness of it, the bigness of the sky. She had grown up in the Louisiana flatlands and had spent 8 months going back to them to help, and now she was looking down at a different flatland 1,000 miles away, and she thought, simply, I would like to see this from the ground. She made it a wish, and then she made it a small, fierce prayer, and then she folded her hands and waited. In row 19, Gus Fenwick had his eyes closed. His lips were moving. Loretta was watching him the way she had watched him for 58 years. She knew every expression his face made, and this one, eyes closed, lips moving slightly, the particular deep stillness of him, was the one she had seen the day their daughter was born, and the day their son went into surgery in 1987, and the morning his brother died. It was the expression he made when he was doing the only thing he knew how to do, when there was nothing to be done with his hands. He was praying. Loretta was not a praying woman. She put her hand over his folded ones, and she thought about Oliver, 4 days old, whom she had seen only in a photograph, and she thought, I am not finished. We are not finished. Let us not be finished. And Gus, feeling her hand, turned his palm up under hers and held on. In row 23, Renata Shields sat with her hands loose in her lap, and her back straight, and her gaze focused somewhere out the window between the sky and the ground. She was running through procedures, not aviation procedures. She knew nothing about airplanes, her procedures, the ones that lived in her body. What to do when a structure is unstable and full of smoke and you cannot see, and the only information you have is what your gloved hands tell you. How to keep breathing slow. How to stay functional past the point where functional is comfortable, past the point where most people freeze. She had trained her whole adult life to be useful in exactly the moment when usefulness was hardest, and so she sat, ready, certain that if there was a way to help when this thing hit the ground, she would find it. Gear down and locked, Briggs reported. Flaps at 5, altitude 8,100 feet. Descent rate 2,100, that is expected. The drag is pulling you down faster now. Do not fight it. Your optimal glide speed is 158 knots. You are at down slightly, just slightly. Find 158 and hold it, adjusting. 160, 158, holding 158, hold that number like it is the only number in the world. She was walking east now, moving toward the center line of the approach path, aligning her own body with where the aircraft needed to be, so that she could see the geometry the way the pilot would see it, so that her eyes and his eyes would be solving the same picture. She looked at the tree line ahead of her. 50 feet of cottonwood and elm along the eastern boundary. The old cottonwood at the southeast corner. She could see the exact height of it against the gold sky. The aircraft needed to clear that by 80 feet. Minimum. She raised the binoculars. Captain, there is a tree line at the eastern boundary of my field, mixed to cottonwood and elm, approximately 50 feet at peak height. You need to clear the tree line by at least 80 feet. This means you hold your approach altitude higher than your instinct is going to tell you to. The field is going to look very small and very close, and every instinct you have is going to scream at you to come down faster and get to it. Do not. Stay high. Trust me, not your instinct. Copy. Clear tree line by 80 feet. Stay high on approach. There are also power lines running along the south fence. Single agricultural line 25 feet above grade. Hold your approach track at least 400 feet north of the south boundary. Stay north of center, north of center. Copy. Altitude 6,300 feet. You are doing well, Captain. A brief pause. The question unexpected, the way the question about the passengers had been unexpected. Dara asked it for the same reason. A cockpit is a two-person thing in a moment like this. The captain flies the airplane, But the captain flies it better when he remembers he is not alone in it. Wren is here. Right seat. She has been running every system check available since the second engine went out, and she has not stopped. Not once. Tell her good job. Another pause. She heard it through the radio, faint. Briggs saying something to his first officer. Few words she could not make out. Then something in Wren's voice, low, steady, a single short reply. Then something from Briggs that might have been a quiet exhale. Or might have been something else. Small human thing passing between two people in a falling airplane. What mattered was that there were two of them up there, and they were both still working. And they were both still functional. And they had each other. Dara knew exactly what that was worth. She had had it once. A voice in the seat beside her on the worst night of her life. A man named Colt who had said almost nothing, and whose almost nothing had been the only reason she got them both home. She knew what it was worth to not be alone in the cockpit. She was alone in her field. But the two of them up there were not alone, and right now that was the thing that mattered. Altitude 4,800 feet. I can see the field. What does it look like? Small. It is big enough. What else? The tree line. See the tree line on the east side. That tree line is your reference point. Stay above it until I tell you to flare. If you cross it with too much altitude, that is fine. We have field to spare on the western end, and the slope will help us with the rest. If you cross it too low, we clip the trees and we have a very different problem, a problem with no good ending. So stay high. Come over those trees with altitude to spare. High is recoverable. Low is not. What about the power lines? You are 400 feet north of center on your current track. Hold that position. The power lines are below you and south. You will not see them. Do not look for them. Looking for them will only pull your eyes off the field. Hold 400 feet north of center and trust the math. Trusting the math. She could see the aircraft clearly now with the binoculars down. The naked eye was enough, was big. Bigger than it had looked on the radar in her imagination of the radar. Bigger than the distance suggested. Big the way things that are falling toward you always seem bigger than you expected. Because part of your brain is measuring not the thing but the threat. The silver fuselage catching the October afternoon light. Wings perfectly level. The landing gear down and extended. She could see all 3 points of it now, the nose gear and the two main bogies, hanging down below the belly of the aircraft, like the legs of something reaching for ground it was not sure was there. Come on, she thought. Then she stopped thinking it. You do not get to hope in the middle of a calculation. Hope is a thing you do afterward when the work is done, when there is no longer anything your hands can affect. She put the hope away. She went back to the numbers. Altitude, 300 visible. Coming up fast, you have more room than it feels like. Your approach is clean. You are above the target glide path, which is exactly where I want you. Do not descend. Do not try to get down faster. Let the field come to you. Coming to me very fast right now, I know. Full landing configuration. Flaps to 30, flaps 30. Airspeed 147 knots. Descent rate. Do not tell me the descent rate. Tell me when you have the tree line in your windshield. Just the tree line. Talk to me about the tree line. 3 seconds, I have the tree line. How does it look? Like a wall? It is not a wall. You are above it. I can see you and you are above it. Trust the approach. Keep the nose exactly where it is. When I say flare, you bring the nose up and you hold it. Not before. Wait for my call. Waiting. She was very still now. Binoculars up. Both eyes on the aircraft. She could read the nose attitude. She could read the angle of approach. She could read. And this was the part that required the 1,847 hours. Required the carrier landings in the dark. Required every bad weather approach she had ever flown and survived and learned from. She could read that the approach was good, not perfect. Nothing was ever perfect. There was a tiny crab into the crosswind, a few feet of drift she would have liked to clean up if there had been time. But good. Better than good for a dead-stick 737 onto a wheat field flown by a man who had never done anything like this in his life. The tree line came up fast. She watched the aircraft cross it. The main gear. She was watching the main gear. That was the part that mattered. Cleared the tallest cottonwood by what her trained eye estimated at 92 feet. 12 feet more than the minimum she had asked for. 12 feet of margin she had not been sure they would have. She exhaled. One breath. And then she put even that away because the landing was not the touchdown. The landing was everything that happened after the touchdown. The whole long roll across the field to the slope. And that part had not started yet. Flare, she said into the radio. Now, bring the nose up. Smooth, let her settle. The nose of the Boeing came up, slowly. Carefully, the way it would come up on a normal landing on a normal day. On a normal runway with all the normal things in place. The lights and the markings and the long black ribbon of pavement and the fire trucks waiting just in case. The wings flexed slightly under the shift and lift distribution. The main gear reached downward toward the pale stubble, and for 2 full seconds, 2 seconds that felt like something suspended outside of ordinary time, the aircraft floated. That was the word for it. Floated. The cushion of compressed air that builds between a wing and the ground in the last seconds of any landing, the phenomenon every pilot knows and feels in their body, thing called ground effect. It lifted the aircraft slightly and held it just as the surface of the wheat stubble. The plane did not want to land. It had been refusing to fall for the last 8 minutes, fighting gravity with the only weapon it had, which was the skill of the people flying it, and now in these last 2 seconds, with the ground inches away, it refused one final time, held itself up. Floated. Gravity disagreed. The main gear hit the ground. Sound reached Dara a fraction of a second after the contact, traveling the 400 feet between her position and the aircraft. A sound like a thunderclap rolled flat across the open field. Something enormous meeting something solid, and neither one willing to give way. The aircraft came down. All 143,000 pounds of it. Hit the wheat stubble at what her eye read as 135 to 140 miles per hour. And the field, her field, the one she had plowed and seeded and walked and harvested and worried over in every season for 6 years. Took it. The stubble grabbed the tires. The tires fought back. The friction was immediate and enormous, and exactly what she had calculated it would be, exactly what she had staked 157 lives on. The aircraft shook. She could see the whole fuselage shaking from where she stood, the long silver body vibrating like a struck thing, like a tuning fork the size of a building. The wings rocked. The nose gear came down and bit into the stubble and added its friction to the equation. Inside the cabin, the world was chaos and noise. The overhead bins burst open. Bags and coats and water bottles flew forward. The deceleration threw every passenger against their belts, hard, the straps biting into shoulders and hips. The roar was beyond anything. The sound of 3/4 of a mile of dry wheat stubble being torn through by 143,000 pounds of metal, a grinding, shrieking, drumming roar that filled the cabin and the bones of everyone in it. Dr. Soleil Okafor braced and held the hand of the woman beside her. Gus Fenwick held Loretta's hand, and Loretta held his, and neither of them let go through any of it. Renata Shields rode the chaos with her body loose and her eyes open, already cataloging exits, already preparing to be useful. Dara was running. She had not decided to run. Her legs had decided. She was moving parallel to the aircraft's path, 200 feet north of it, running through her own wheat field in the autumn afternoon, binoculars bouncing against her chest, watching, measuring, counting the distance off in her head against the marks she had placed there. "Brakes," she said into the radio, breathing hard. "Everything you have. Stand on those brakes." Both feet, brakes max, decelerating. I don't know if... The western tree line was out there ahead of the aircraft. The distance between the silver nose and the trees was closing. Closing. 500 feet of field consumed. The aircraft still moving very fast, too fast. But that was expected. The first 500 feet was always going to be too fast. 1,000 feet. She could hear it now over her own breathing and footfalls. The roar of the tires tearing the stubble. The grinding friction of all that weight fighting all that speed. 500 feet. The aircraft was slowing. She could see it. The motion was changing. Deceleration becoming visible, becoming real. The speed bleeding off into the friction of the field exactly the way the calculation had promised. But the tree line was still coming. 2,000 feet. 2,500 feet. Then something changed. The nose dipped. Slightly. Just enough to notice if you were a person who had spent 14 years learning to notice. The aircraft had reached the drainage slope, the 3 degrees. The grade that nobody else on Earth had measured or thought about, or known to choose this field for. The slope took the slight forward pitch of the decelerating aircraft and turned it into downward pressure on the gear. And the downward pressure turned into friction, and the friction turned into braking, and the braking jumped. Dara felt the jump in her chest more than she saw it, the sudden new bite of deceleration, the field doing exactly the thing she had bet everything on it doing. 3,000 feet. 3,200 feet, the western tree line was right there. Close. Too close still, her heart said. Even 1,400 feet. Then the nose lurched left, just slightly. Just enough. The soft patch. No, not the soft patch. She had routed them clear of the soft patch. Some unevenness in the stubble, some patch of softer ground, some asymmetry in the braking, the left main gear grabbing a half second harder than the right. The kind of thing that means nothing at 30 miles an hour, and means everything at 60. The kind of thing that can swing a heavy aircraft sideways and turn a successful landing into a cartwheel in the space of a single breath. Dara saw it before Briggs felt it. That was the whole value of being where she was, on the ground, beside the aircraft, seeing the geometry from outside that he could not see from inside. She saw the nose start to swing, and she knew exactly what it would become if it was not stopped right now. Right rudder, she screamed into the radio. First time her voice had risen above its level calm in 8 minutes. Right rudder now. Now in the cockpit, Briggs Callahan's right foot drove the rudder pedal to the floor before his conscious mind had finished hearing the words. Reflex, the reflex of 19 years, finally meeting the one moment it had been built for. The rudder bit the slipstream. The swing stopped, the nose came back. The aircraft straightened and ran true down the line of its own deceleration. He did not know how close it had been. He could not have known, from inside, with the world shaking and roaring around him. Only Dara knew, watching from the field, that they had come within a single second and a few degrees of losing everything in the last 400 feet, 3,600 feet. The aircraft stopped. Silence, after 8 minutes of falling and 8 seconds of thunder silence. The particular silence of a thing that has been catastrophically loud going suddenly, completely quiet. The tick of cooling metal. The hiss of hydraulic pressure bleeding off. And underneath it, almost too quiet to hear from where she stood. The sound of 157 people inside a silver fuselage discovering, one breath at a time, that they were still breathing. But Dara could not see the aircraft. The landing roll had torn 3/4 of a mile of dust and chaff and broken stubble up into the air. And now it hung there, a great gold cloud catching the low October sun, drifting and swirling between her and the place where the aircraft had stopped. The whole field seemed to have exhaled every particle it contained into the space between them. She could not see it. She pressed the transmit button. Captain Callahan. Report, nothing, Captain Callahan. Report your status. 1 second. He had run the numbers 1,000 times, and the numbers had said it would work, and she had bet 157 lives on the numbers, and now she could not see the aircraft, and there was no voice on the radio. 2. This was the half-second again. This was 2003 again. This was the silence after the thing happens. The silence where you find out whether your judgment was enough. The silence she had been living inside for 6 years. She did not breathe. 3, 4 seconds. 4 seconds that were longer than any combat mission, longer than any night carrier landing, longer than the entire 8 minutes that had come before them. 4 seconds standing in a gold cloud of her own field's dust, not breathing, the radio dead in her hand, every doubt she had ever carried, rising up at once to tell her that this was the moment they were finally proven right. Then, Iron Hand, Briggs Callahan's voice. But not the controlled voice from before. Not the voice of 19 years of professional aviation holding its pulse together by main force. Something rawer, something cracked open, something human in a way that cockpit voices are almost never permitted to be. We are stopped, we are. Everyone is, Iron Hand. We are okay. We are okay. And the breath that Dara Kelleher had been holding for 4 seconds went out of her all at once. The dust shifted, a cross breeze from the northwest. The same 8 knots of crosswind she had calculated and Briggs about 8 minutes and a lifetime ago, pushed the great gold cloud sideways. It thinned, it stretched, it began to clear, and through it, 180 feet from the western tree line, the silver fuselage of United Twin 49 emerged into the October light, intact, no fire, no structural collapse, no wing torn away. Just a large commercial aircraft sitting in a Kansas wheat field, covered in dust and chaff and the debris of the longest landing roll in the history of either of them, nose gear canted at a slight angle from the violence of the ground contact, looking, there was no other word for it, looking slightly stunned. Like something that had been through a thing it had not expected to survive and had not yet caught up to the fact of its own survival. The emergency exits opened. The yellow evacuation slides deployed, blooming out from the fuselage and inflating in the gold light. People 1, 2, 5. They came down the slides and tumbled into the wheat stubble, and some of them fell and stayed down, and some of them sat where they landed, and some took 2 stumbling steps, and then stopped and turned their faces up to the wide blue October sky, with an expression that had no single word for it. The expression of people who had finished falling, who had been given the ground back, who had been handed their own lives a second time in the space of an afternoon, and did not yet know what to do with the gift. Dara walked toward the aircraft. She had not decided to walk. She was simply walking, across the torn and trampled stubble of her own field, toward the silver thing that should not have been there, toward the people pouring out of it into the gold light. 10, 20, 30, 40. She counted everyone. She could not have stopped counting if she tried. The counting was automatic. The counting was the thing her mind did to keep itself from feeling the enormity of it too soon. 50, 60, 80, 100. Dr. Soleil Okafor came down the forward left slide, landed in the stubble, stood and looked at the horizon, and then at her own hands, and then back at the horizon, very still, recalibrating. A woman who had wished to see this flatland from the ground and was now standing on it. Gus Fenwick came down a slide with Loretta right behind him, and the instant she was off it he turned and caught her, and held her, his face buried in her gray hair, and she held him back, and they stood in the wheat stubble not speaking, two people who had been married 58 years and had just been granted a 59th. Renata Shields came off a slide already moving, already scanning, and was at the side of an older man who had twisted his ankle on landing before anyone else had even registered he was hurt, crouching beside him in the stubble, talking to him low and steady, doing the things she could not stop doing, things she had been built to do. 120, 140, 155, 156, 157. Briggs Callahan came out last. He had walked every row first, checked every seat, confirmed every exit. He had done the thing a captain does, which is to be the last living person to leave, and then he came down the forward slide and walked across the field toward the woman in the dusty green jacket who had not moved from where she stood. He was shaking. Not a little, thoroughly, head to foot, the way a body shakes when it has held itself rigid for too long and is finally allowed to come apart. His uniform was soaked dark through the back and under the arms. His face was the color of old paper. Stopped in front of her and looked at her for a long moment and could not at first find any words at all. Then he found four. "You talked a commercial jet onto a dirt field. You flew it," she said. "I just gave you information. You gave me more than information." His voice broke on it and he let it break. "When I heard Iron Hand come over that radio, I believed we had a chance. That belief is the only reason I could fly that approach. You understand? The numbers got us down, but the belief is what let me fly the numbers." Dara looked past him at the jet sitting in her field, at the 157 people scattered across the stubble around it, sitting, standing, holding each other, weeping, laughing, calling home, at the 180 feet of torn wheat between the nose gear and the western tree line, 180 feet of margin, almost exactly what the slope had promised her. Just she raised the radio one last time and keyed the transmit button, and her voice, when it came, was level again. "Iron Hand again, Kansas City Center. This is Iron Hand. United Express 2749 is on the ground. All 157 souls present and accounted for. We are going to need some buses." The field was full of living people. That was the fact of it. The simple, staggering, still not quite believable fact of what Dara Kelleher was standing in the middle of. 157 human beings who had been falling out of the sky 40 minutes ago, who had been sitting in a powerless aircraft doing the arithmetic of their own deaths, and who were now standing and sitting and kneeling in a Kansas wheat field on an October afternoon, alive, every one of them, in the gold light. Some were crying, some were not. Some were on their phones, speaking to people at the other end, who were crying even though they had not been on the plane and did not yet understand what had almost happened. That was the strange thing Dara noticed, standing in the middle of it. The people who had been on the plane often seemed calmer than the people they were calling, because the people on the plane knew it was over. They had already passed through the worst of it and come out the other side. The people on the other end of the calls were just arriving at the terror, just beginning to imagine the thing that had not, in the end, happened. A young man sat in the stubble and laughed and could not stop. A woman knelt with her forehead on the ground like she was praying, or like she was simply unable to stand. Two strangers held each other and rocked. The flight attendants moved through it all with that same trained steadiness they had carried down the aisles, checking on people, finding the ones who were hurt, doing the work, because the work was the thing that held them together. And the three Briggs had named came to find the woman who had brought them down. Dr. Soleil Okafor came first. She crossed the field with a purpose in her step that she had probably carried every single day of the 8 months she had spent in rural Louisiana. Tall, composed, her white shirt streaked gray from the evacuation slide, her eyes clear in a way that suggested clarity was not something she happened to feel, but something she had trained herself to maintain no matter what. She took Dara's hand, both of hers. "Held it. My patients needed me home," she said. "There is a man named Willis Broussard, 63 years old. I have been treating him for 11 months. He was supposed to be discharged from my care next week. Her composure flickered for just a moment, the way a candle flame bends and steadies. Because of you, I will be there when he is. Dara looked at her, at the dust on her white shirt and the steadiness in her eyes. Go home, doctor. Silzio squeezed her hand once, held it a second longer, then let go and walked back toward the cluster of passengers near the aircraft. And Dara watched her go and saw that she did not walk toward a quiet place to sit down and shake. She walked toward the people, toward the woman who was kneeling with her forehead on the ground. Already a doctor again, already back at the work. And Dara filed that away. The way she filed certain things away, not because she decided to keep them, but because they insisted on being kept. A woman who had just survived the unsurvivable, whose first instinct was someone else's care. Some people were simply built a certain way. The afternoon was full of them. The afternoon was, in fact, built out of them. Gus and Loretta Fenwick came together. Of course they came together. 58 years, and they still moved like one thing with two bodies. The way a long marriage builds a kind of gravity between two people that makes separation seem to violate some physical law. Gus was crying. He was not trying to hide it and not quite succeeding, and clearly had complicated feelings about both facts. Face did the specific thing that older men's faces do when they are crying and embarrassed about it at the same time, trying to hold on to dignity with both hands while being entirely unable to stop the tears. Loretta was not crying. Loretta was watching her husband cry, with the expression of a woman who had spent 58 years watching this particular man feel things fully and without apology, and who had long ago stopped finding it anything other than one of the things she loved most about him. She had something in her free hand, a photograph, printed from a phone, the paper still slightly warm from a pocket, the image a little pixelated from being blown up larger than the file really allowed. A baby, 4 days old, wrapped in a blue blanket, the squashed, brand new, faintly outraged face of someone who had just arrived in the world and had not yet had time to form a single opinion about it. "This is Oliver," Loretta said. She held the photograph out to Dara the way you show someone something sacred, not asking for approval. Just because the sacred thing deserved to be seen, and because the woman standing in front of her was the reason it would go on being seen. He was born 4 days ago. We have never held him. We were going to hold him tomorrow. She looked at Dara with steady, unflinching eyes. The eyes of a woman who understood with complete precision exactly what had almost not happened in this field, exactly how close she had come to never holding her grandson. And now, she said, we still can. Dara looked at the photograph, at the small outraged face, at the blue blanket, at the whole future folded up inside a 4-day-old child who would grow up and never know how nearly his grandparents had vanished out of the Kansas sky before they ever touched him. Go hold him, Dara said. Loretta nodded. Then, because she was a woman who left things finished, she added one more thing. She looked at Dara's face for a moment, studying it, and she said, he has your eyes, I think, or Oliver. Steady. Like nothing in the whole world scares them, she took Gus's arm. They walked back across the field together, his face still doing what it was doing, her letting it, the two of them moving as one thing with two bodies toward the rest of their lives. Renata Shields came last of the three. She came in her work clothes, because she had been in her work clothes on the plane, a fire department t-shirt and cargo pants, dust-streaked now, which was exactly the kind of person she was. Someone who did not keep a separate, better-dressed self for special occasions. She had finished settling the older man with the twisted ankle, handing him off to a flight attendant with a few quiet instructions, and now she came and stood in front of Dara, and stood up straight. Not at attention, not military, just upright. The way a person stands when they want to be seen clearly and have nothing to hide behind. I help people in fires, she said. I know. You're flying to get an award for it. I don't usually get to be the one who needs the help. She said it like it was an unfamiliar and slightly uncomfortable fact she was turning over in her hands. Sitting in that seat, nothing to do, nothing I could do. I have never in my life had nothing I could do. Nobody usually does, Dara said. That's the hardest part, not the danger. The helplessness. Renata looked at her for a long moment, and something passed between them. A recognition, the particular recognition that passes between two people who have both spent their lives being the one who runs toward the thing everyone else runs away from. Then Renata looked at the aircraft, and at the 180 feet of torn stubble between it and the trees, and back at Dara. Thank you, 2 words, no decoration, the kind of thank you that has the entire weight of a person behind it and needs nothing added to it. Dara nodded. Renata nodded back, the same nod, complete in itself. and walked away to find someone else who needed helping, because that, too, was a thing she could not stop doing. The FAA investigators arrived 90 minutes after the landing, 3 vehicles bouncing down the county road and out across the field. 7 people. Cameras and clipboards and equipment cases. The methodical infrastructure of people whose entire profession is to understand what happened after something has happened that was not supposed to be able to happen at all. Director Aldine Pruitt led them, 60 years old. Silver hair cut short and practical. Kind of face that had heard a very great many things in a very great many circumstances and had trained itself to receive all of them with the same level. Evaluating, unhurried attention. She had been with the agency for 22 years. She had walked more crash sites than she could easily count, and most of them had not looked like this one. Most of them had not had 157 survivors standing around in the gold light waiting for buses. She set up a portable table at the edge of the field, in the long shadow of the cottonwoods, and she sat across from Dara Kelleher, and she asked questions for 2 hours and 47 minutes. Good questions. Specific questions. Questions that took Dara's competence as a given and went straight to the technical heart of things without wasting a second on the parts that were already obvious. What was your initial estimate of the descent rate, and how did you arrive at it? How did you assess the surface hardness of the field? What was your margin calculation for the tree line? Walk me through the slope. Walk me through the moment the nose swung left. Dara answered everyone, directly, without ornament, in the same plain, sequential, unhurried language she used for everything that actually mattered. At the end of 2 hours and 47 minutes, Director Pruitt set down her pen. She looked at Dara for a long moment across the portable table. Commander Kelleher, she said. She had used the title without deciding to. It had simply surfaced, the way certain things surface when a professional's honest assessment of a person overrides the careful habit of leaving credentials out of it. I have investigated 212 aviation incidents in 22 years. I have never, not one single time, seen a successful dead-stick landing of a commercial aircraft of this class on an unprepared surface with every soul aboard surviving. It has not been done. It is in the literature as a thing that does not happen, and I am sitting in a wheat field looking at it. Captain Callahan flew an excellent approach, Dara said. Captain Callahan followed your instructions to the letter, and he flew them beautifully, and he would be the first to tell me he could not have done it without the voice in his ear. There is a difference between flying an approach and designing one. He flew it, you designed it, in real time. From the ground, with no instruments, Pruitt tapped her notebook with one finger. I want to come back to the slope. The Whitmore Field, 6 miles north, was longer and flatter and would have looked safer to every engineer in this agency. Radner offered it. You declined it inside of 4 seconds. I need to understand why. The slope at the western end of my field adds approximately 14% additional braking force across the final portion of the landing roll. Normal force on the gear increases as the aircraft pitches forward onto the downgrade. Increased normal force increases the friction available at the brakes. I calculated that at the aircraft's estimated weight and speed on this surface, slope would yield 170 to 190 additional feet of effective stopping distance compared to a flat field of identical texture and moisture. The Whitmore Field's extra length would not have compensated for the lack of slope. It would have looked safer, and it would have killed them. Pruitt stared at her, not in disbelief. In something closer to professional awe held very carefully in check. You calculated a friction coefficient adjustment for a 3-degree drainage grade in your head, in real time. While conducting continuous voice communication with a distressed flight crew you had never spoken to before. Yes, you have been out of aviation for 6 years. Dara looked out across the field. At the aircraft, still sitting in the lengthening shadows, the passengers being walked in small groups toward the buses that had finally arrived and were lined up on the county road. At the 180 feet of torn stubble between the nose gear and the trees, you do not forget that kind of training, she said. Does not leave you. It just goes quiet. You stop using it, and you tell yourself it's gone, and you almost believe it. A pause, until you have to use it, and then you find out it was never gone at all. It was only waiting. Director Pruitt was quiet for a moment. She looked down at her notes, and then she did something that was not in her protocol, not in her training, not in the careful boundaries of the 212 investigations she had conducted before this one. She set the official part of herself down for a moment. The way you set down a heavy bag, Commander Kelleher, she said. There is something in your file. I read it on the drive out here. Because when Radner gave me your name, I recognized it and I wanted to understand who I was coming to talk to. Dara went very still. The incident at Nas Oceana, the winter of 2003. The investigation report you refused to sign, the field seemed to go quieter around them. The wind in the stubble. A hawk somewhere up in the wide blue, the distant idle of the buses on the road. I know about it, Pruitt said, because it touched my agency eventually in a small way. The technical review came across our awareness. So I can tell you something you may not know. She paused, and she chose her words with the care of a woman who understood exactly how much they weighed. That report was formally reopened in 2007. An independent technical review of the original flight data was conducted. The review found that the maneuver sequence itself was flawed, that the procedure carried an unmodeled failure window under the conditions present that day. It found that the two pilots followed procedure correctly. Two senior officers responsible for the original falsified findings were formally censured and removed from their positions. Dara did not move, did not speak, and the families, Pruitt said, more gently now, were notified. Both families. They were told the correct record. They were told it was not their son's fault. There was a silence then that was not empty. Were they told? Dara said at last, and her voice was very careful. The voice of a person carrying something across a great distance without letting it spill. Were they told it was not the pilot's fault? In those words, did anyone actually say to them, "Your son did everything right"? Yes, Pruitt said, in those words. They know. Dara looked out at the field. She thought about a 26-year-old and a 28-year-old. She thought about a pregnant widow learning to sleep alone 6 years ago, and she thought about that same woman, a mother now, 6-year-old who had never met his father, receiving a letter or a visit or a phone call, telling her that the official story she had been handed had been a lie, and that the man she lost had not failed, had not erred, had done everything correctly, and been killed by a flaw that someone chose to bury. She thought about a half-second in 2003. The half-second she had carried in her chest like a stone for 6 years. The half-second she had been so certain was the whole story, was her failure, was the reason she did not deserve to fly, and she understood, not all at once, not completely, but enough, that the half-second had never been the story at all. The pilots had been inside a failure that was built before they ever strapped in. Nothing she could have said would have changed the physics. The thing she had punished herself for, the thing she had passed a 6-year sentence over, had not been a failure of hers. It had been a flaw of someone else's, hidden behind a lie she had refused to sign. She had been right. She had been right the whole time, and she had spent 6 years believing she was guilty of something the rest of the world had finally, formally, agreed she was innocent of. She exhaled, a long exhale, the kind that takes something with it when it leaves, the kind that empties a space that has been occupied for a very long time by something heavy, something lodged, something that had sat in a chest like a stone set in clay, present, immovable, waiting, moving now. She did not cry. That was not the right word for what happened in her face and her chest and the space behind her eyes in the next several seconds. It was quieter than crying and larger than crying. It was the particular thing that happens when a person sets down a weight they have carried so long they had stopped feeling it as a weight and had started feeling it simply as the shape of who they were. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Director Pruitt nodded, picked her pen back up, and, because the work was the thing that held her together too, went back to her notes. 3 days after the landing, the Navy called, a rear admiral, retired now, like her. Someone Dara had flown under 20 years earlier, when she was a lieutenant and he was a commander, and the whole world had been arranged differently. His voice on the phone was older than she remembered, sanded down by the years, but the same underneath, the way a familiar coastline is the same even after the tide has moved everything around on it. He told her that word had gone through every squadron on both coasts, that her name had come up in briefing rooms and ready rooms from Virginia Beach to San Diego, that pilots who had not thought about Iron Hand in years had spent the last 3 days thinking about nothing else. She thanked him. She said it was Captain Callahan who flew the approach. He said that was a gracious thing to say, and also somewhat beside the point, and she heard him smiling when he said it, and she found to her own surprise that she was almost smiling too. 2 weeks after the landing, she heard them before she saw them. She was in the barn, working on the combine belt she had finally gotten back to replacing, the one she had been meaning to deal with for 3 weeks before a certain October afternoon rearranged her sense of what was urgent, the wrench in her hand, the light going gold and long through the open barn door, and then sound. Not the drone of a crop duster, not the buzz of a Cessna out of Newton, bigger than all of that. Bigger and lower and getting closer. She came out of the barn into the light. They came from the northeast. 6 of them. FC-18 Super Hornets out of Naz Oceana. She knew the profile before she could even pick out the shapes clearly. The way you know a voice before you can make out the words it is saying. Low, 800 feet. In a tight formation, the kind that takes years of practice to hold, the kind that requires every pilot on the edges to trust the lead absolutely, to fly within a few feet of catastrophe on faith. They were coming directly toward her farm, over the wheat field, over the exact 180 feet of stubble between where the aircraft had stopped and where the western tree line stood. She stood in front of her barn in her green jacket and watched them come. They crossed overhead at 800 feet with the sound of everything she had spent 6 years telling herself she did not miss. All 6 of them. The sound went through her chest like something with physical weight, like the sound itself was solid, like it had mass and momentum. The sound of engines at full military power tearing the October air, the sound that had been the soundtrack of 14 years of her life and then had vanished from it for 6, and was here now, all at once complete, so that the 6 years of silence collapsed into nothing, into less than nothing, into a held breath finally let go then, as the 6 aircraft crossed directly over the wheat field, over the precise ground where 157 people had stood 2 weeks before in the gold light, alive when every law of probability said they should not have been. All 6 rolled their wings left, then right, a single motion, perfect unison. 6 aircraft moving as one, the wing rock salute, the oldest gesture in all of aviation. The way pilots say, someone on the ground, the thing there are no words large enough to say. She knew exactly what it meant. She had given that salute herself years ago over the casket of a friend. She knew it in her body. And then the lead aircraft, the one at the very point of the formation, the position she herself had flown 100 times, the position that carries the responsibility for everyone behind it, broke away from the others, pulled its nose up, climbed. The afterburner lit, a column of white fire blooming behind it, and the aircraft drove straight up into the wide Kansas blue, climbing and climbing, leaving a hole in the formation where it had been. The missing man, the oldest and most sacred formation in military flight. The empty space in the sky where one aircraft should be and deliberately is not. Flown for the fallen. Flown for the ones who do not come home, except this time the empty space did not mark an absence. This time it marked a return. This time the fire climbing into the blue was not grief. It was the opposite of grief. It was the Navy reaching across 6 years and 4 states to say to a woman in a green jacket standing in front of a barn, "We know what you did, and we never forgot who you were, and you are still one of us, and you always were, even when we let you walk out the door alone." And Dara Kelleher did not try to stop what happened to her face. She had not cried when the dust cleared and she saw the aircraft intact in her field. She had not cried watching 157 people slide down into the wheat stubble. She had not cried when Loretta Fenwick showed her a photograph of a 4-day-old child, or when Soleil Okafor said the name Willis Broussard, or when Renata Shields stood up straight and said 2 unadorned words. She had not cried through 2 hours and 47 minutes of investigation, or when Director Pruitt told her that the families knew, that the record was corrected, that she had been right the whole time. She had held herself together through every single piece of it. But this got through 6 aircraft at 800 feet over a Kansas wheat field, the wing rock. The missing man flown not for the dead but for the living, not for an absence but for a homecoming. Fire instead of emptiness in the wide October sky. This got all the way through. She stood in front of her barn with the tears running down her face and she let them run. Her phone rang in her jacket pocket. She took it out, looked at the name on the screen, and answered it. Iron Hand. The voice belonged to Colt Devereaux, her wingman on 2 deployments. The man who had flown the left seat to her right seat on the worst night of her first cruise, when the weather had closed in over the ship and the deck had pitched, and she had brought them both home on instruments and instinct. And the thing that earned her name. The man who had said almost nothing that whole night, and whose almost nothing had been the only thing that kept her steady. The man who had left messages on her voicemail occasionally for 6 years, not many, not pushing, just enough every few months to say without saying it, "I am still here, you are still you." Whenever you are ready, she had never once called him back. She answered him now on the second ring. "The whole Navy," he said, his voice rough with something. "Both coasts, every squadron. Everybody knows what you did out there." She could not answer for a moment. "We never forgot you, Dara," he said. "Not one single day. You never stopped being one of us. Not when you left. Not in 6 years, not ever. I need you to know that. She looked up at the sky where the 6 aircraft had been and now were not. The wide, pale October blue she had chosen for herself 6 years ago when she needed something larger than the thing she was carrying inside her. "I'm a farmer, Colt," she said, and her voice cracked on it, not from grief, but from the sheer impossible weight of being seen. A pause on the line, then Colt Devereaux said, "Iron Hand in overalls." Hell of a look, and Dara Kelleher, who had not cried for 6 years and then had not cried through any of the impossible afternoon, and had finally let herself cry standing in front of her barn watching fire climb into the sky. Laughed, a real laugh. The kind that comes up from somewhere below the sternum, from a place that has been closed off so long you forget it is there. The kind that cannot be performed and cannot be faked. The kind that only happens when something held very tight for a very long time finally, all at once, lets go, and the letting go finds the only door available to it, which turns out after everything to be a laugh. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. The same 4 seconds that had been the longest of her life 2 weeks ago in a cloud of gold dust. Except these 4 seconds were the opposite of those. These 4 seconds were her whole self coming back into the room. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, the hand that had earned the name, the hand that had never shook. Hell of a look, she agreed. October 2010. Phoenix, Arizona. United Airlines held a ceremony. Briggs Callahan was there. Ren Sato was there. All 5 flight attendants, and the passengers, 143 of the 157. Some had flown in from across the country, which Dara thought was its own quiet act of courage, getting back into the metal tube after what the metal tube had done to them. Some had driven for days rather than fly. Some had driven to an airport and then made themselves get on a plane, white-knuckled the whole way, which was the specific kind of bravery that has no official name and deserves one more than most of the kinds that do. The venue was a hotel ballroom. Round tables. White flowers. The careful arrangement of an occasion that people very much wanted to mark correctly. But the careful arrangement kept dissolving in the best possible way, kept being interrupted by people catching sight of each other across the room. Strangers a year ago, bound now by the single most important afternoon of their lives, and crossing to each other, and the crossing mattering more than wherever the seating chart had meant them to be. Dara arrived in a dark blue blazer she had bought in Wichita the week before. Not a uniform, not a gown, the middle option, the clothing of a woman who had learned a long time ago to dress for the work and not for the occasion, and who was doing her best to split the difference for a thing that was, she supposed, an occasion. She had almost not come. She had thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything, turning it over alone in the quiet of the farm. She was not a ceremony person. She had built a whole life on purpose out of not being the center of anything, 380 acres of being left alone. But Briggs had called her, and he had said something simple and entirely unmanipulative and completely impossible to refuse. He had said, "You should see who they became. You gave them the years. Come see what they're doing with them." Dr. Soleil Okafor found her first. She was not in scrubs and not in the dust-streaked white shirt of a year ago. She was in a deep green dress, and she carried a photograph, and she was smiling in a way Dara had not seen on her in the wheat field, where there had been no room for it. The photograph was a man, 63, maybe 64 now, standing on a porch in Louisiana. Dara could tell it was Louisiana from the green of it, the wet, heavy green that Kansas never had, standing with 2 small grandchildren leaning against his legs, smiling the particular smile of a person who has been recently unexpectedly given more time than he thought he had. "Willis Broussard," Soleil said. "I was there for his discharge. 3 weeks after I got home. He's doing his physical therapy. He's going to dance at his granddaughter's wedding, he tells me, though the wedding is 15 years off and the granddaughter is 6. Dara looked at the photograph, at the porch, at the 2 children leaning on the old man's legs. "He was scheduled to be discharged while I was still in Kansas," Soleil said quietly. "If the plane had gone down, I would not have been there. Someone else would have signed the paperwork. He would have gone home to that porch without me ever seeing it." She looked up. "But I got home, so I was there. Because of you, I was there. Gus and Loretta Fennick came with their daughter, and with Oliver, 1-year-old now, and walking, the particular, unsteady, ferociously committed walking of a 1-year-old who has recently discovered that locomotion is possible and has resolved to do it constantly, in all directions, forever. He came tipping across the ballroom floor toward Dara from foot to foot, arms out for balance, his grandmother's hand hovering 2 careful inches behind his back, ready to catch him, not quite touching, letting him do it himself. He made it all the way to Dara under his own power. He stopped at her knees, looked up at her, regarded her with the solemn, unhurried evaluation of a person who is still in the process of forming his opinions about almost everything and takes the work seriously. Gus did not trust himself to speak at first. He took Dara's hand in both of his and held it, that was all. For a long moment, just held it, the way he had held Loretta's hand all the way down through the longest 8 minutes of his life. He took his first steps 8 days ago, Loretta said, in our kitchen, right between the table and the stove. Gus cried. I did not, Gus said, in the unmistakable voice of a man who absolutely thoroughly had. He cried, Loretta confirmed, with 59 years of authority now. And then, to Dara, the thing underneath all of it, we were there for it. We got to be there. We held him the day after we landed in your field, and we have not been able to stop since. And we were there in the kitchen when he stood up and walked. Oliver, having completed his solemn evaluation, reached up and seized 2 of Dara's fingers in one small determined fist and used them as a handrail to execute a slow, triumphant, wobbling pivot turn. It worked. Renata Shields came in her dress uniform. She had received the National Valor Award the very morning after the landing. There had been some debate, Dara later learned, about whether to postpone it given what the awardee had just been through. And Renata had refused the postponement, had arrived at the Department of Justice building in Washington at 8 in the morning, still carrying the dust of a Kansas wheat field in the seams of her cargo pants, because there had not been time to go home and change. The official who presented the award had noted, for the record, that the recipient appeared to have had an unusually full 24 hours in Phoenix. In her dress blues with the medal at her chest, she looked the way certain rare people look when they are exactly where they are meant to be, doing exactly what they were built to do. I thought about what you did, Renata said, for a year. Pretty much every day I thought about what you did, Dara said, getting up out of that seat. Walking the aisle when you couldn't fix anything. It's harder than running into a fire. A fire at least you can fight. That was just... Renata started and stopped and reconsidered. That was just the only thing there was to do. Yes, Dara said. Exactly. That's exactly what it is every time. The only thing there is to do. And you do it. She let that sit. That's the whole job, Renata, for both of us. You just do the thing there is to do. Renata looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. The same nod from the wheat field, complete in itself, needing nothing added, and she did not walk away to a quiet corner. She walked off into the room to find someone who might need something. Of course she did. Ren Sato found Dara near the end of the evening. She was younger than Dara had pictured her from the steady voice on the radio. Late 30s. Quiet eyes that had clearly spent years in cockpits learning that composure is a skill you build and not a temperament you are born with. She did not say very much. She handed Dara an envelope, plain white, slightly creased from a pocket. Inside was a single sheet of paper. One sentence on it, in careful handwriting, it said, I want to fly like that someday. Dara looked up from the paper. You already do, she said. I heard you, the whole way down. You never broke, not once. Briggs flew the airplane, but you held the cockpit together, and I heard it. You already fly like that, Ren Sato smiled. The first full smile Dara had seen from her, in the wheat field or anywhere. And she took the paper back, folded it, returned it to her pocket like something she intended to keep, and walked away into the warm noise of the room. Briggs Callahan spoke last. He stood at the front of the ballroom, and he talked about the 8 minutes. About the particular silence of 2 dead engines, which he said was unlike any other silence in the world. The absence of a sound that is supposed to be there, the wrongness of it registering in the body a full second before the mind catches up. He talked about the checklist that did nothing, about the moment he and Ren had looked at each other and the look had held everything 2 people can say to each other when they have run completely out of options. And then he talked about the voice on the radio. She gave me information, he said. Heading, configuration, airspeed, tree line clearance, brake technique, a number for the flare, all of it exact, all of it correct. She gave me over the radio everything I needed to put that airplane on the ground. He paused, and his eyes found Dara at her table near the back. But the information is not the thing I will remember for the rest of my life. The thing I will remember is that when I heard the call sign, when I knew who was on the other end of that radio, I believed, for the first time since the engines died, that we had a chance. And belief, when every other thing has been taken away from you, when the engines are gone and the airports are gone, and the sky is running out beneath you, belief is enough to make a person keep fighting all the way to the ground. He raised his glass. Everyone in this room is alive because a woman in Kansas was just a farmer. Until she wasn't, the drive back to Kansas took 7 hours. She left Phoenix before dawn, the desert still dark and cold around the highway, her headlights laying down 2 straight lines into the black, then the desert going gold as the sun came up over her right shoulder. Then New Mexico, then the long flat reach of the Texas Panhandle, then Oklahoma, then at last Kansas. She crossed the state line in the early afternoon. Sky changed at the border the way it always changed. Or maybe it was only that she knew she was home and her eyes opened differently to it. Wider, flatter. The particular blue that was hers, the blue that painters tried to capture and never quite managed, the blue that had been the first thing and would be the last thing. She got back to the farm at 2:30 in the afternoon, almost exactly 1 year to the hour, from the moment a silver shape had come down out of that blue, with both its engines dark. She parked the truck in the yard, sat in it a moment with the engine ticking, looked at the barn and the fields, and the wide October sky arched over all of it. Then she got out. She walked to the field. The wheat had come up beautifully this season. She had planted it in April and worried over it in May when the rains came late, and stopped worrying in June when it came in green and even and unbothered. Now it was cut like last year, 3 weeks past the harvest. The ground was pale stubble again, firm under her boots. You could not tell, standing in it, looking at it, you could not see a single trace of what had happened here. No marks, no scars in the ground, no torn earth, no gouges from a nose gear, no sign at all that a silver thing had once come screaming across this field with 157 lives inside it. The field had absorbed the whole event the way land absorbs everything eventually. Rain, drought, the plow, the turning of the seasons, passage of things that feel while they are happening like they must leave a permanent mark and do not. The land takes it all. The land forgets or forgives, which on a long enough scale are the same thing. It was just a field, her field. She stood in the middle of it, where she had stood with a radio in her hand a year ago, and she let her mind go where it wanted to go. It went to Willis Broussard on a Louisiana porch with 2 grandchildren leaning on his legs, 15 years from a wedding he intended to dance at. It went to Oliver Fenwick, tipping wobbling across a hotel ballroom, and seizing 2 of her fingers for balance. It went to Soleil Okafor back on a plane to her patients, looking out a window at an altitude from which falling is not survivable, having survived it. It went to Renata Shields walking off across a ballroom to find someone who needed something, because she could not stop, because some people are simply built that way, and the world is held up by them. It went to 2 young pilots at NAS Oceana, gone now 7 years, and to their families, who knew the truth at last. To a widow who had learned her husband had not failed. To the weight of a wrong record set straight, late, so late, but set straight all the same. And how late was a hard thing, a bitter thing, a thing she would have feelings about for the rest of her life. But how late was not the same as never. How late, in the end, was its own kind of mercy. It went to 6 FC-18s at 800 feet, and a column of white climbing into this same wide blue, the missing man flown for a homecoming instead of a loss. It went to Colt Devereaux's voice on the phone, to Ren Sato's 1 sentence on a folded sheet of paper, and it went, last of all, to a radio on a shelf in the barn behind her. Power light glowing, static humming low, switched on every single morning for 6 years for a reason she had never let herself name. She knew the reason now. She had known it for a year, and had spent the year understanding what she knew. The waiting had been for something real. The waiting had had a date, a heading, a descent rate of 900 feet per minute, and an airspeed of 158 knots, and a tree line and a slope, and 157 people who would walk out of this field into the rest of their lives. The radio had not been a habit. It had not been practicality. It had been the last unbroken thread between the woman in the green jacket and the woman who had earned a name. The thread she had told herself she had cut, and never quite had, and was glad now, more glad than she had words for, that she never quite had. Nothing wasted, not the 14 years, not the 1,847 hours, not the landings in the dark and the carrier decks and the bad weather approaches she had flown until they lived in her hands below the level of thought, not the calculations she had run 10,000 times until they were faster than thinking, and not either the 6 years of farming, not the plowing and the planting and the harvesting, not the long solitary seasons, not the knowledge of exactly where the spring water sheeted off the western end of a wheat field at a grade of 3 degrees that no one else on earth had ever measured or needed. All of it, every single piece of it pointing at this. At one October afternoon, without her ever knowing it was pointing anywhere at all, which is maybe how it always works. which is maybe the thing no one tells you while you are in the middle of your one life, doing what looks like one thing, that it is never only the one thing, that every skill you ever build, and every hard thing you ever survive, and every quiet, ordinary piece of knowledge you ever pick up without thinking it matters, is accumulating toward a moment you cannot yet see. A moment that will need exactly what you have, exactly what you learned, exactly who you became in all the chapters you thought were unrelated, until the moment comes, and then you find out. She walked back to the barn. The combine belt still needed replacing. The leaning fence post in the north field would have to be reset before the ground froze hard. The soybean numbers needed logging before she forgot the details of the yield. An ordinary day, the ordinary, holy, sufficient work of an ordinary life. She went inside. The radio sat on the shelf where it always sat. Power light on. Static humming low, the same low hum it had hummed every morning for 7 years now. The sound of a frequency held open against a sky full of things that moved through it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned to the combine and picked up her wrench and got back to the work. The radio stayed on. It would stay on. Because the sky was still out there, wide and blue and full of things that fly, and some of them, someday, would be in trouble. Because the math did not stop being true just because the afternoon was over. And because once you have been the one in the field, the one with the knowledge, and the radio, 3 degrees of slope that no one else knew about, you do not stop being that person when the moment passes. You cannot. It is not a thing you can give back. You carry it differently, that is all. At different points in a life, carry what you are differently. Sometimes in a flight suit and a call sign on both coasts. Sometimes in a green jacket with a tear in the left shoulder, on your back in the dirt with grease on your hands. Sometimes folded up and put away on a shelf, under 6 years of silence behind the belief that you were finished, but you are not finished. You are never finished. You are only waiting, and the radio stays on, just in case.